Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Again this week, Afghanistan. Because as we speak, U.S. forces are trying to take out stranded Americans as the Taliban is now running the country. And who would have thought? In 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan seemed justified. America had been attacked by al-Qaeda, and the plot to fly planes into the World Trade Center was hatched in those dusty, sand-blowing training camps under Taliban rule. The mission of NATO countries became kill or capture the terrorists, eliminate Taliban rule, and nation build so Afghanistan could stand on its own. For a while it seemed to go right, before it went so wrong. And the American departure has been a train wreck, leaving U.S. forces holding a thin patch of turf at Kabul airport. The Taliban is back in power, and Americans and their allies are asking, was it worth it? Any of it? In a moment, U.S. Army veterans I met as a journalist traveling in some of the most remote areas of Afghanistan as they fought the Taliban. But first, the New York Times chief correspondent in Washington and a friend, Peter Baker. All right, I'm joined by Peter Baker. Peter, great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you.
So you and I were Moscow-based in 2001. I was with NBC. You were with the Washington Post.
Yeah.
And we were among the first to immediately get down to Tajikistan and then cross into Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And could you imagine a more surreal ending to this 20-year story than American troops holding a sliver of ground on the edge of Kabul, asking the Taliban if they can still keep some kind of humanitarian corridor open so they can get people evacuated from there. And the president of the United States asking the Taliban now, could they possibly extend the August 31st deadline if he makes that request? But he's being urged to do it.
Yeah, no, the whole thing is very surreal. I would start by saying that when we went in, you and I, way back then, 20 years ago, you knew what you were doing. And the difference is that I was a complete amateur. But it was a hell of an experience to see Afghanistan in those days after 9/11, to see a place that had been ravaged by war and civil war and the Taliban repression for all of those years. And it was a different moment. We thought there was something possible then. And of course, within a very short amount of time, the Taliban fell. And we would never have imagined then we would see the scene that we're seeing today. 20 years later, the Americans essentially driven out in failure, the Taliban flag over the presidential palace. As you say, the CIA director flying into Kabul basically to beg permission from the Taliban to let us stay a little longer just to get our people out and get our Afghan allies out. It's a remarkable, ending to a 20-year venture that obviously is a black mark on America's place in history. And it's a tragedy, not just for Americans, especially those who died in a war that's ending this way. It's a tragedy for the Afghans who are going to be left behind, 38 million of them now, returning to a state that you and I found them in 20 years ago, where they lived in a virtual, medieval fiefdom run by people with very, very dark views of society.
Yeah, I wish I did know what I was doing at that time, and I'm sure you did better than I did trying to navigate the dust storms and the sandstorms and trying to find the Northern Alliance up in the mountains, firing artillery and tank fire, T-60 tank fire at the Taliban's front lines as the Taliban had just, killed Ahmad Shah Massoud, the lion of the Panjshir, and were threatening probably to push into Central Asia, possibly Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. I mean, there was a lot at stake then.
Yeah. A lot at stake, and I think we were just talking. You were set up in Ahmad Shah Massoud's house where he had been killed. I visited that house and saw the room. This was a predecessor, a preceding event to 9/11. The Al Qaeda people, for those who don't remember, assassinated Ahmad Shah Massoud 2 days before 9/11 in order to destabilize the resistance and to curry favor with the ruling Taliban so they wouldn't be mad when they saw what they had done from Afghan territory to Americans in New York and Washington. And that moment in time was so fraught, and we didn't know what was going to happen, but it definitely was not, I think, on our radar screens that it would end this way. I mean, everybody understood that Afghanistan was a tough place, that it wasn't going to simply become a Jeffersonian democracy overnight, that the British had failed there, the Soviets had failed there, and the Americans could very well fail there. I just don't think that anybody imagined it would be quite like this.
There was a huge famine underway. And I'm sorry, I didn't want to journey into the past 20 years ago, but I mean, there's a lot of parallels and relevance to what's going on now. I mean, Afghanistan was on its knees financially. The Taliban didn't really run a country. They were a fighting force of some kind, and really not much more than that. And if you take a look at Afghanistan now, the people say 9/10 of the economy is driven by Western nations that have come in and tried to rebuild the country. Suddenly, take all of that away. The Taliban may be back in power, but they are looking at a looming economic collapse, hunger, unrest. It will turn around and bite them very quickly.
Well, very, very, very likely could. And as you rightly say, the Taliban is not a conventional government in the sense that we are used to thinking of it. It's a tribal country where they have knit together, in effect, a coalition at times, uneasy, of different radical groups in order to claim ownership now of the country. But it's hardly a given that they can manage or govern this place, much less run an economy. You're right. And I think that you still have ISIS there. You still have pockets of Al-Qaeda there. You have the Hekmatyar wing. I mean, there's all these different sort of, warlords. It's a very complicated tapestry of politics and religion and ethnic tribes and languages, one that we never fully got our own heads around in 20 years there, which I think is one of the problems. And going forward, it just has the potential to be a massive humanitarian crisis right there in the middle of Central Asia. So we want, the United States wanted to get out, understandably, after 20 years of fighting, said, okay, it's enough, it's their problem, but it could very well become our problem again, maybe in a non-military way. But if you're right, 38 million people, a country of 38 million people suddenly are starving or facing great, humanitarian crisis, that will ultimately play out beyond their borders too.
I know you've written a lot about President Biden. Why did he do this? How did he get here? And the article that you wrote, the headline was, Biden ran on competence and empathy, and Afghanistan is testing that. That seems like a pretty polite way to say that the president simply doesn't have any empathy, and his competence, is hugely questionable now after this total collapse in Afghanistan. Well,
I think that he ran, of course, Joe Biden last year on the idea that he was a grown-up. He ran the idea that he would bring maturity to the room and also compassion, that he felt people's pain, as opposed to his predecessor, who, of course, never did give that. But this last couple of weeks he has had a hard time demonstrating either. It does not look like the most competent moment in any presidency. And certainly he has not really evinced a lot of compassion for the people who are going to be suffering as a result. It's really actually striking that when he gets up and talks publicly, he defends the decision, understandably, of course, that's what presidents do, but he doesn't seem to project the kind of empathy we thought we expected from a Joe Biden about what's about to happen and what's already happening to the Afghan people, much less.
Is that just political strategy where you just don't want it? Washington doesn't want to admit they're wrong. They don't want to say we got this wrong. And you quoted David Axelrod, a former Obama strategist, as saying that Biden's eagerness to end the war overran planning and execution.
Yeah, I think that President Biden made this decision in effect 12 years ago. Back in 2009, when he was vice president, and President Obama made an Afghan review to decide whether or not to send more troops, Biden was basically against the large influx that Obama eventually approved. And I think from that moment on, he was determined, if he ever became president, that he would pull out, that Afghanistan had more or less proven that we can't succeed there, that we weren't making things better. Certainly after 2011, when we eventually caught and killed Osama bin Laden, there seemed to be less of a political imperative to stay there. And I think his decision was made regardless of any advice he was going to get, any discussion of the consequences. And of course, he would say, well, President Trump signed this agreement, which is all true. President Trump did negotiate basically a withdrawal agreement with the Taliban that said, we'll get out, we'll free your prisoners, we'll lift sanctions as long as you don't shoot us on the way out. So it's not like President Biden is the only one here who wanted to do this, but I think he was bound and determined going in to the White House. But in the end, of course, it was President Biden who made the decision to go forward and do this. It was President Biden who made the decision, to do it the way he's done it. And I think that, of course, that's on him, and he will defend himself, and people will hold him responsible if they think he's gotten it wrong.
I know that you would have been asking a lot of people, why didn't you stay? Why didn't the U.S. stay with a small number of troops, 2,500 or 3,500? Hard to do after Trump had paved the road with these negotiations directly with the Taliban in Doha and cutting out the Afghan government. What would have been the potential price if the U.S. had decided to stay and support the Afghan government? Would they have become targets, or what was the idea?
Yeah, President Biden argues that he was really in an untenable position when it comes to the idea of having stayed, because if he stayed, then it would have been breaking the Trump agreement, and the Taliban would have then retaliated with great force, and we would be in all-out war. What he's doing is he's framing the choice as either do what I want to do, or it will be like 100,000 troops and the height of war all over again, as if there are no options in between. And that's something that President Obama used to do all the time too. Either you do my decision or it's all out war, which you don't want.
And not believable?
Well, I think it's a rather limited look at the possibilities. I mean, the truth is, for a very small number of troops, around 4,500 or 5,000 troops there, more or less, over the 5 years prior to the Taliban's agreement with President Trump, there had basically not been a whole lot of combat. That for a very relatively small investment of forces, America had brought a certain degree of stability to Afghanistan, outsized, really cost effective, you could argue. In fact, in the 5 years prior to this, there were very few casualties. There's casualties, and everybody who dies in a war is a tragedy, but basically fewer than 20 casualties a year over the last 5 years. So we were not fighting a big pitched war over these last 5 years. Now, what people say is that's an unsatisfying status quo, that's unsustainable in the long term. How long are we going to simply sit there? We're not making it any better. But I think what we've seen is we also can make it worse. And that's what's happened in the last few weeks.
Do you think there's serious fallout from NATO allies, in particular NATO allies? It just wasn't NATO countries that were in there, but there's a lot of, here in Europe, there's a lot of criticism daily that the US just pulled the rug and went too quickly, and NATO countries are furious that this has collapsed the way it did.
Yeah, I think it's rather remarkable to hear President Biden say, as he did last week, that, gosh, he doesn't hear any questions of credibility from the allies. If that's the case, then he's not listening, because, as you say, the allies have been pretty clear that they think this has been handled badly. The Chancellor Merkel's designated successor, if he wins, said this is the greatest debacle of NATO history. Our reporting says today that the Czech leader said, even as far back as June, that this was a betrayal. You've heard people like Theresa May and Tony Blair and the French and plenty of others say that they are very unhappy with the way this was handled. Not necessarily the decision to get out, but certainly the way that we got out.
And that they weren't really consulted, to quote Tony Blair.
Yeah. Now, look, people would say, look, Tony Blair is a compromised figure because he was for the Iraq War, and the Iraq War was such a debacle, and therefore, why should we listen to him? He's just a warmonger, and I that's a strong feeling among a lot of Americans here. But having said that, what's really striking is it was President Biden who says, I'm going to work hand in glove with the allies. If Trump was, anti-alliance, I'm pro-alliance. And I think this is, created a fissure right at the beginning of his presidency that we didn't expect.
Two questions. The Taliban, once this, I don't want to call it an evacuation party. It's far from anything that's celebratory. But once this debacle ends at the end, possibly in a week or two, you think the U.S. is about to get very tough with the Taliban inside Afghanistan?
I don't think that's really, I'm not sure what tough looks like. We're not going to obviously become their economic partners. We're not going to be, their friends. We're not going to be, inviting them to international summits. But I think that President Biden wants to wash his hands of it. His view is it's their problem now.
And do you think that the U.S., which has been called upon by many different government leaders around the world to finally get tough with Pakistan, that Pakistan to a large degree drove the insurgency, supported the Taliban, probably hid Osama bin Laden and has sheltered Al-Qaeda, that the U.S. at some point has got to get tough with Pakistan, or will they just fall back and say, we don't want to get too difficult with a nuclear power such as Pakistan?
Yeah, President Biden has made that point in the past. Back when he was vice president, he talked about how we needed to be tougher on Pakistan, but there's been no sign of it so far since he got into the White House himself as president. Maybe he will, but I wouldn't expect. I don't think it's their priority at this point. I think their priorities are elsewhere: China, Russia, other places. And I think that their plan is to basically, leave it to the people in that region to take care of and move on. Basically, it's been 20 years. Enough is enough. That's the view here.
Peter Baker, thank you so much. I think it's a sad ending to what you and I started to cover. That had a lot of people say that there was a lot of hope for a new Afghanistan, but here we are again, and it's probably worse than it was 20 years ago when we went in. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate you talking with me.
Thanks a lot, Peter. The people who may feel most deeply the U.S. rapid pullout from Afghanistan and this never-ending question of was it all worth it, those people will be veterans who served there. And there were, and I had to read this 3 times to fully digest it, that there were 800,000 U.S. soldiers who went through Afghanistan over that 2-decade period. Among them was former Army Sergeant Shane Reese from FOB Tillman and Sergeant Francisco Morales. And we also are joined by retired Brigadier General Art Austin, who didn't serve in Afghanistan. He was in Iraq, but he now deals with and helps with a lot of veterans back in the U.S. So hello to everyone. Let's start with you, Francisco, because, I've known you now for over a decade, and I met Francisco and Sergeant Reese at FOB Tillman. And Francisco, one more time, if you don't mind, just setting the stage. Where was FOB Tillman and what was this place? Because it's so hard to describe to somebody who had never been in Afghanistan. And this post, to me, was like something out of a World War I movie. I mean, it was that rugged and that kind of pioneering.
Right. So FOB Tillman was in the Paktika province in Lawara, Afghanistan. And it was also coined as the last outpost because we were literally on top of mountaintops and in valleys that were close to no one and anyone. And less than a quarter of a mile was the border to Pakistan.
Yeah. And I could stand up there with you and you could point and you could see the Pakistan border and where the Taliban would cross over and attack you from.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And we were literally in bunkers while we were there. And we didn't always have the best air support or air assets to cover us. So we knew that, like the Wild Wild West, you weren't going to have the support you needed. And we had to rely on each other right there on the actual OP. And whatever came to us, we had to deal with it right there with what we had in hand. I mean, my men were well trained and we've always had the upper hand, but it was knowing that we are out here and nobody's coming quick.
Yeah, and it's in the middle of nowhere. And so Sergeant Reese, did you ever get that image out of your head? I mean, I was only there for a few days with you guys, but, driving through the mountains, these incredibly isolated, not only the FOB, the Forward Operating Base, Tillman, but all of the OPs up in the mountains where, 7, 8, 9 of you would sit there at night guarding kind of first line of defense from the Taliban before they tried to hit the FOB.
Yeah, it's an image that was never really, or it's an image that will never really be forgotten. And I could probably very proudly say that for myself and for many others that were there who served either in 10th Mountain or units before us. It was the no man's land. It was the land that was either going to break you or shape you. And it was an area to where we would be going through valleys up to the highest peaks. And you said it best, Pakistan border was right there. We got hit a lot, but we really did make a great impact in that area.
You got hit a lot and you almost got overrun on some of those OPs. But so let me, now spin the clock forward, and these images now of Kabul being overrun by the Taliban, complete collapse of the Afghan government and the Afghan army. You feel like when you were there, you made a difference and you reshaped that area. How in the world did we get to where we are now if it was successful?
So while we were there, we did a lot of missions with the Afghan National Guard, and then we also did missions with the Afghan Army. And there was a complete difference between the two organizations. So the Afghan National Guard, I would say, were like your countrymen, the people who really want to change, and the Afghan National Army, to how I would describe them, were guys who were just part of any organization that was going to be able to give them any kind of monetary value to help out with their families and whatnot. I don't think they were really there to soldier. I think they were just there to honestly collect money and whatnot, because we had experiences with, the Afghan National Army ANA guys who were actually riding both coattails. They were wearing two different uniforms at the same time. So working with the ANA, the Afghan National Guard guys were great. They helped us out. We could count on them. And then we didn't feel that comfortable when we worked with the Afghan National Army and their police officers. We were responsible for training Afghan police officers within our area. And it was tough for my soldiers to really understand how to train these guys with the language barrier, but that they weren't disciplined. They didn't seem like they really wanted to be there. They definitely didn't feel and look like the Afghan National Guard guys, who you can tell love their country, wanted to be there. They were taking in everything that we were giving out, and they would do anything for the country. And I just wish that whoever was left in charge were guys like the Afghan National Guard compared to the Afghan National Army.
General Austin, do you want to take a run at this? I mean, did anybody imagine all that effort and all that time, and suddenly it's been wiped away in a week?
Well, I have a group of guys that I meet with, that I serve with in Iraq. We meet every year, kind of have the same conversation. It's much like what Francisco talked about. You look back at the time that you spent and effort that I spent out in the red zone, with training police. That's basically what I did over in Iraq. From their national security force to all the bits and pieces, neighborhood policing, electric police, oil police. I think we planted a seed, something that gave them an idea of change and what's possible. So I can only hope that the same thing happened in Afghanistan.
I'm going to take a big breath, because you would think that seed had 20 years to grow. Shane, I want to bring you in here. 20 years to grow. And, guys who really talked about an Afghan army, the pride of being in that army, an independent Afghanistan, that they would stand up and defend the country. It all rings pretty hollow right now.
Yeah. Going back to what Frank said, there really was two levels of groups. There was the group who loved their country, wanted to be there. I'm not saying that, and I can't say that for everybody, but you can definitely tell the difference fighting with these guys. A lot of them were ex-Mujahideen. I have a photo with one of the guys on one of our OPs who was probably in his 40s, 50 years old, maybe a little bit older at the time. And he was telling stories about when he was young going against the Russians and how now he wants to help protect his country. We have some great interviews that we would screw around and get with these guys, just talking to them while we had free time. But then you had the Afghani police who seemed timid, seemed like, this was a bad decision, but they're doing it because it was they were getting paid. I think right now with the current events, and I'm not sure on how much of it is true, but I know from just conversations I've had now with a lot of these soldiers, Afghani police, who have had issues getting paid. So I'm almost wondering, is this a moment where, hey, we're not gonna do what we're doing anymore. We don't need to protect our city anymore. Why? We're not getting paid, right? They haven't getting paid for 3 weeks or longer. So that's a question I have, right? And there's a lot of questions that I think a lot of people have right now for the administration, but something went wrong. Something definitely went wrong. And I think there's going to be a lot of answers that need to get addressed soon.
Are you disappointed that, intelligence always gets blamed for intelligence failures, but are you disappointed that the U.S. administration didn't see this coming? Or do you think they did see it coming and simply said, we're just going to fold our cards and get out now because there is no long-term solution anymore, that they gave up the whole notion that the Afghan government would be able to stand on its own over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Speaking to friends that I have in the intelligence community right now, from the common thread is there's disappointment. However, I think the answer that we're getting forward facing is the unknown. Why were these decisions made? I mean, it's almost like opening up like a Ranger handbook. You'll have your mission intent, and then you have your contingencies, you'll have your emergency planning. Like there's phases to do a full rip out like this. But it's the decisions that we're in right now. It's kind of left myself and a lot of other veterans dumbfounded. It's frustrating because I personally feel, and not putting too much emotion into it, but we should have been out of the war a while ago. We did our best effort. But there has to be a plan in place to not have these current events that are happening now.
Francisco, does it leave you feeling the same way? Are you a bit angry about how the withdrawal was handled, if indeed it was the right thing to do at all?
I always say that this was going to happen, whether it happened we withdrew 5 years ago or whether we withdraw 5 years from now. I always felt like this was what's going to happen anyways in this direction. As far as being upset and angry, I was not personally, and I would say that because the men that fought with us that were in Afghanistan, the interpreters that were there with us are all in the United States right now. So that kind of gave me like a deep breath of relief. Like, okay, the guys that really helped me that I'm, miss and get to speak to on a monthly basis are here in the United States, which is great. And so that relieved anger from me, but it does, bring back memories of, well, we lost some good men over there. We lost Sergeant Green in my platoon while we were in FOB Tillman. And, were we supposed to be there at the time? During our deployment, we did our year, we were on our way home and got turned around, because issues were still going on within our local area and we knew the area the best. So when we went back 2 weeks before coming home the second time, we lost our young man in that area. So you think about, well, maybe these young guys who passed away would still be alive right now if we would have dropped out 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So,
yeah, I think, Francisco, you run over that pretty quick, but people don't know you're already there for a year. You were told you were going home. You got to Kuwait, most of you, and then you were turned back as part of one of these surges, and you had to do another, how many months?
I think it was 4 or 5 more months, Reese.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Total 16, I believe.
Yeah. So, General Austin, Art, if I can ask you, how many of these soldiers that come back are still struggling with what they saw, what they experienced, with PTSD? And does it matter in conversations with them when they kind of go through their losses? Does it matter to them that it was a success in the end and that now they're seeing this collapse and failure? Does that weigh on them? Or does their PTSD issues simply, not go hand in hand with whether Afghanistan was worth it or not?
I would say that, and I live in a small community in Western New York, Cuba. I think the biggest difficulty, because veterans will do what veterans will do, They will do their best. The biggest issue that I have dealing with our veterans and our local communities is our local communities for the last 20 years have not understood that we've still been at war, that we're sending young men and women over to have sent young men and women over to Afghanistan to fight this nation's battle. However, they've been stuck, it appears to me, back in World War II, when there was a bigger heyday. So every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, I have to regenerate, re-event this message to our community that we still have people involved in orchestrating this nation's policies over in Afghanistan. Even in my small community, if I had at least, at last count, 6 PTSD-related deaths. And to try to associate with what we're seeing today in the newsreels, it seems that there's no connection to what veterans have experienced. So I think these conversations need to go on. They need to go into further depth about what we've actually done. I think most of Americans are tuned out of Afghanistan 10 years ago.
I was one of the first reporters into Afghanistan after 9/11. I haven't tuned out, but it's important that you note that there's another generation or two that just simply don't relate to Afghanistan and what went on there. And Americans themselves had to learn a lot in a very short period of time what Afghanistan was all about, and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda links and all of that. So for a lot of them, they just want to forget about it. And I guess the U.S. administration wants to do that as well. But I mean, you had to preach as a leader, as a commander, and you sergeants had to do it as well, about motivating young people after 9/11, why they were there, why they had to stay on, what the job was, and what you were accomplishing. Now, how do you resolve that in your own mind? Because you nation build, but then the nation has collapsed, and you defended America, but now the same group that you fought against, the Taliban, will be back in charge of the show in Afghanistan again, and their links to Al-Qaeda remain, according to sort of all of the experts. So forgive me for the long question, but that's kind of how we lay it out, I think, to some degree. Francisco?
So, there's going to be a long healing process, and the healing process has begun when the first soldier came back home from war and became a civilian/veteran. And the process have gotten better as far as veteran support, because there's so many veteran programming out there now. But especially with this situation that's going on now, it's like ripping off that scab and exposing everything again one more time. So we as Americans got to look at, okay, maybe some people are tired of hearing support the veteran, but literally now you really got to help them out, because they're going through a different kind of pain, of what they just gone through. Now it's being re-exposed. Now that we know better after 20 years of helping veterans out, let's put all those tools to use now and help out these veterans who are experiencing what's going on now. So me personally, if say Shane calls me and he's frustrated about what's going on, I don't give Shane my opinion about this. I don't talk to him about politics. I just listen to him and what he has to say and how he's feeling, because what he's feeling and what I'm feeling could be two different things, even though Shane and I were in the exact same place, experiencing the exact same thing. And all I can do now is make sure that Shane doesn't become a 22, that I don't become a number 22. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is be there for each other and continue to do programming, for instance, like Shane did with the whole Lionhearted program.
Sorry, what's the number 22?
So 22 a day of veterans commit suicide. My apologies. But being able to really put forth all those programmings that were there for us in the past, bringing them to surface, sharing lionheartedfilm.com with our veterans who are experiencing events that are going on, to show them that there's other veterans out there that are just like them, going through some harsh times. That's going to help us heal if we're able to do that.
Well, Shane, Francisco raises this point. I mean, 22 suicides a day by which I think the latest survey says suicides by Army vets are 1.5 times the national average, I think, but by the latest statistics. But so Shane, will you take a run at this? That when you hear a lot of old Vietnam veterans, they said they experienced all this horror, and they came back to a nation that didn't care, didn't think of them as heroes, didn't appreciate their service, their sacrifice. Do you think that there are now some pretty serious parallels with Afghanistan as well? Because before they would say, okay, well, we won the war in Afghanistan and we stood up an independent government. But now a lot of people will say, well, there was no point to that war.
Yeah, there is. And I think the term ripping the Band-Aid off, I think Frank said that's an accurate description of what's happening now. And yeah, I have talked to a lot of Vietnam vets, not actually currently, but just in the past about what it was like coming home, especially doing the Project Lionhearted. But I feel right now there we may have some similar similar stories that are going to be happening with a lot of veterans. But that's where helping a veteran out, helping each other out. I think the form of communication is the best healing process, to be able to talk about these things that we have been through, the things that we're thinking about currently now. For me personally, I feel we went over there and did the best effort we could. That's why we joined the military. We put one foot forward. We continued to move forward. And I have no remorse and feel like we didn't accomplish something, because I firmly believe that we did accomplish something. I saw it firsthand, and we gave our best effort. And I don't think we could look at it now as feeling like a failure. Those aren't our decisions, right? So, am I disappointed? Not really, because what was even talked about earlier is there was what was the resolution of this whole thing? At what point is it enough, right? So, I have friends that have been in way longer than I have, 15, 20 plus years. They're kind of saying the same exact thing, but I don't want to look at it as a failure. I think we all gave our best effort. But coming back home right now with a lot of veterans feeling that the Vietnam mentality, I hope it doesn't go that route. But I think we have enough experience now on how to deal and help veterans through that process if they are.
All right. Art Austin, what would you say? I mean, when these young, not so young, some of them now come up to you and say, was it all worth it? And everybody's saying that it was a complete waste of time. What would you tell them?
Well, I would say my experience has been most of our military personnel, it's an individual thing. I mean, it was talked about earlier. You could be on the same compound, on the same base, same fob, and come back with a different experience. It's what you put into it as an individual. And I would say, 99% of our soldiers did their job, and they can feel good about doing their job. Once you've done that, whatever happens or comes out of that, well, that's up to them. I was fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to have started my military career back in the late 70s. I enlisted back in 1977. All of my platoon sergeants, platoon leaders were fresh out of Vietnam. So the concept now of post-traumatic stress, suicide connection, well, some of the same things were going on then. However, it was not nationalized as it is now. We have to continue to communicate. And I would communicate to the young folks or whoever asks that question. But hey, these are some of the greatest patriots you'll ever meet. We've done our job. We do our job, and we'll continue to add value to our community. But I think the missing piece is they have to understand what these individuals have gone through, or understand what Afghanistan is all about. That message has to be a lot clearer than it has been in the last 20 years.
And I guess a lot of people would argue that, look, the mission was accomplished pretty early on. America was attacked. U.S. soldiers went in to disarm al-Qaeda. to kill or capture, and then nation building was what came next. But the prime mission was to go in and defend America, which had just come under attack.
Yes. And I would say Americans would realize that fact that, hey, we have our Independence Day, our Labor Day will be coming up, and everybody can feel free about getting in their cars, going to work and coming home and not having to fear or understand or even relate to the images that they have on national television this past week.
Francisco, you want to wrap it up here? I mean, I think you're always generous with your time. We've done a few of these segments where we've talked about Afghanistan. And I mean, here we are in a surreal situation where American troops are down to their last piece of turf at the airport in Kabul, trying to get Americans and other foreign nationals out, asking the Taliban for safe passage through Kabul. And maybe that's going to unravel in the coming hours or weeks. It's not a good situation, but you know, take us home here. What are your thoughts?
I always knew that the hardest part of this conflict in Afghanistan was going to be the exit strategy. You know, we went in and did our job. You know, throughout the 20 years we were there, we went in, we did exactly what we wanted to do every time, and we're just handing the baton over to the next group of soldiers, the next group of soldiers. That wasn't the hard part. I always knew that the exit strategy was going to be the worst portion of this whole mission. And whoever had to deal with that was going to have a tough time. And they were going to take the brunt of all the negativity that's going on about Afghanistan. So the current folks who are there now experience this. They're going to be the ones that are feeling the actual harshness of this. The leaders involved now, from who's in the service now to all the way to the top. You know, they're going to be the ones who have to answer to all of this stuff. But I think that when we talk about exit strategies for us as veterans, our exit strategy now is let's make sure we're exiting from that, but going into something that's going to help each other out. Let's make sure we're calling each other, call your battle buddy, take them out for a cup of coffee, you know, put yourself in situations that are going to help out with stress relief, you know, do something positive, you know, promote whatever organization you want to promote. It doesn't have to be necessarily veteran related. Just get yourself out there and do something positive. So that way, this is not a loss for you. This is not a loss for your battle buddy who died. You know, I'm moving on for Sergeant Green. Sergeant Green's mom stays in touch with me, and she sees my growth. She watched my kids grow up. She see me, had a daughter afterwards. I see Mrs. Green every 2 years at least. You know, and she even told me, Frank, don't come back for a few years. Stop keeping this burden, which I don't know if I'll ever let go. But now it's move forward, live your life. You know, it's always going to be there. It's never going to go away. But, you know, I can't fix it, but I can help monitor it and I can help manage it. So let's all help each other manage in the direction that we're going now. You know, that's all we can do. And just become great leaders in whatever domain we decide to do it in whatever capacity as well.
All right, and Shane, I don't want to cut you out. You want to add to this before we say goodbye?
No, I think Frank's absolutely right. You know, we're on our last piece of turf, and there's a lot of effort to make sure that this is a smooth process. On the military side, with our American citizens that are still over there, and then also a lot of the interpreters, right? There is a lot of effort that's not seen on the news right now, trying to get everyone out as much as possible. There's also veterans right now that are helping give information back and forth to get out a lot of these interpreters and make this a smooth transition as well. So it's there's a lot going on. It's a mess. And I think Frank just hit it on though, but like, what are those next steps for us? And we're going to have to continue to push forward like we did in the military. We're going to have to better ourselves and better those around us and communicate and talk and being able to willing to share stories and being able to just have the willingness to articulate the situations we dealt with over there, talk about what's going on currently now, and be a community. You know, that's the biggest thing is in the military, you're a community. You have that camaraderie, you have that teamwork. When you get out, that should never go away. It should never go away. And in fact, it should only be enhanced because you're going to meet so many other people. So it's a interesting time right now, but I can only hope the best for what we have over there that are still remaining as far as, our civilians, and hopefully get the rest interpreters out. And there's going to be plenty of guys just like everyone on this call that are just willing to help other veterans out and talk and help them through that transition.
Well, some good news, some good personal news, and that is that my producer in Afghanistan, who I was in Afghanistan a couple of dozen times, and he, as of last night, was able to get his family on a plane and get out. So so he's safe with his family and starting a new life. I mean,
incredible.
In his late 40s, but he's out and he's safe. So Sergeant Shane Reese, Sergeant Francis Morales, and General Art Austin, really a pleasure and an honor to talk to you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing this.
And that's our backstory on Afghanistan. Hard to let this story go. I invested so much of my time there as a TV reporter, and I'm sad the way it's ended. It's not good for NATO, for America, but most of all for Afghans. Let's just say Afghanistan is to be continued. Please share Backstory. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.